Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for accepting the presentation. Apologies from Alison, she's on other business and can't get back in time for this. So we'll just kick off and start. Societal impact and meaningful understanding of the protected wrecks. The A1 is a case study. So I got involved with the A1 through Martin, who's a licensee, after some reported illegal potting and damage was caused on the site. And after some frustration, just said to Martin, you need to write a project design for English Heritage so they understand exactly what it is that we need to achieve. That's part of the management speak. That's part of the management way of doing things. So the relationships just sort of built up and carried on from there. And we're just going to present some of our initial findings from the conservation statement and management plan that we have been contracted by English Heritage to do. So next slide, please. Over to Martin.
Okay, so this is where I come in. Hello, everybody. So I'm the licensee of A1 and I've been the licensee for the last 18 years. Although we've got an A1 timeline here, my story I'm going to talk about at the moment starts in 1987 when the submarine was snagged by a local fisherman called Willie Pledger. He's a Selsey fisherman, and presumably he was doing some trawling over in Bracklesham Bay when he got his net snagged. The first initial dives were done in the November 1987 by a couple of guys, Gordon Harriott and Keith Lintott, and they went out with Willie in his boat called Steel Princess and did some diving. Sadly, the visibility was so bad that they just couldn't really see anything. And they had to go back a week later, and at that point then they decided it was some kind of early British submarine or early submarine, they weren't sure what. And from there onwards, from 1987 through to 88 and eventually into 89, it was quickly discovered in the early years that the submarine was actually a British design submarine, and it was the A1 in fact. The picture of the hatch, which is just below the diver, suggests that in the early years, that was one of the first things that was decided to be recovered, purely on the basis that in that era, divers were very much in the mindset of just taking what they could find. So in order to preserve it and keep it safe, it was taken off in a very early stage. We move up to 1989. It wasn't actually officially promoted as being found until the 12th of May 1981. And that's 18 months later after the first initial dive. So at that point, the wreck was bought by a local chap, Martin Woodward, who bought it from the MOD. And he actually runs a shipwreck centre on the Isle of Wight, and Martin basically has spent most of his 50 years of diving collecting artifacts off a whole raft of wrecks around the Isle of Wight. And you know, in his defence and his benefit, he's bought all these artifacts, preserved them, put them on display at his museum or the shipwreck centre on the Isle of Wight, and it's well worth a visit if you are over in that direction anytime. Moving on to 1997. So in August 97, the ADU at the time, it was the contractor, I think, for Historic England, they got involved and did some investigative work. And they basically concluded that the submarine was more or less in good condition. Some of the plating was missing. But in general, it was there as a complete vessel. There was evidence of interference from divers at the time, and presumably this is some of the local divers that have been taking stuff from the submarine. And also they sort of suggested that fishermen and anchoring of vessels had also been going on around the submarine. So it's that point that in 1998, a designation order was put in place. And it was laid before Parliament on the 5th of November, 1998, and came into force on the 26th of November with a 100-meter exclusion zone, which is not a huge amount, considering the wreck itself is 20 meters long, or the bit you see of the wreck is 20 meters long. So in 2004, another designation order was put in place to actually increase the size of the protection area up to 300 meters, and that's the one that's actually in place as we speak now. Moving on to 99, so it's in those sort of early years, it seemed to be very much a free-for-all, even though the wreck was owned by Martin Woodward and he paid good money for it from the MOD. Then it was quite obvious that people were just effectively looting the wreck when nobody was there and whatever tides were available there. And a local club, Chichester Bezac, they were actually involved with trying to police some of that and also recover some of the artifacts. But the initial dive team was formed back in 87, was a group of divers from a group that called themselves Triton Divers. So they were instrumental in sort of recovering a lot of the artifacts that Martin now has in his museum today. Moving on to 2003, Wessex Archaeology, who was the government's archaeological contractor then. They did some contracts to do some sub-bottom profiling, magnetometer surveys, and the first multi-beam, which is the image that you can see there. And that image has been around for quite a long time now, and it's a very popular image. In 2005, Wessex also undertook a series of dives from September to October, and they also came across a couple of anomalies, one of which we're quite clear about, which was a metal object, and another one that seems to have been disappeared over time. And then in 2006, I became the licensee of the wreck, and from that period onwards, then we also were involved with doing some ultrasonic thickness testing of the wreck. MSDS did some multi-beam work as well, and of course the first diver trail was put in place with the help of the NAS to get that sort of into full operation. So in 2021, illegal potting took place over the site again, and this isn't the first time, but this is certainly the time that's caused the most damage to the wreck. And so a large amount of rope and cuttlefish pots had become entangled around the wreck, and basically it's caused some damage over time with wave and tidal action has actually started to cause damage on the wreck, and some of the plating has been damaged around it, big chunks of plating, and it's hard to sometimes imagine how this happens, but the power of the tide and the waves is probably responsible for it, along with these heavy pots and ropes that have wrapped themselves around the wreck. So this damage was reported to Historic England and Sussex Police, but to date no perpetrator has been identified. And we've got a little video here, hopefully this may play, just to show this is Doug involved with actually starting to cut off some of the ropes that are wrapped around the wreck. So moving on, we've also got illicit diving going on, and this is an interesting case within itself, that the pots obviously were owned by a local fisherman. We don't know which one yet. We have some suspicions. And in order to, he obviously couldn't recover his pots in a normal way. So he is either a diver himself, or he knows a diver that he then sent down on one occasion to actually recover some of the pots that weren't damaged and close to the wreck. So this is another example of illicit diving. Here you can see on the left-hand side one of the cuttlefish pots. The image on the middle of the bit of rope, that's been cut by a diver as he's recovered the pots for the fisherman. The other little clamp idea is, you'll see on the right-hand side, that's a pipe clamp that's been stolen from the wreck. It's been undone, and It's some diver that actually didn't make it to the surface, but it was found after a storm event. I found it on the seabed, along with a large lump hammer, which was obviously part of the diver's kit as well. And the image on the bottom is a more recent image. So when we were doing the work recovering the rope from the boat, then there was yet another potting fishing boat in the area, just demonstrating that it's all going on all the time. I'm going to move over to Doug now. So Doug, if you want to pick up on this.
Okay, so as we can hear, it's, it is a protected wreck site. It does fall within certain management regimes and frameworks under English Heritage, and we were then contracted in to remove the illegal potting materials which was causing damage to the site. After that, having looked at the site and tried to understand its significance and what has been written about it, another project was put forward to create a conservation statement and management plan to help manage the actual site for future generations. So when looking at these things, I usually do the usual, which is go see what are we talking about, heritage management, what does it say about this on the OED, and no, your eyes aren't going everywhere. This is using a set of qualitative analysis using NVivo software to highlight the key terms that you will find within all these policies. Some people might count sheep to get to sleep. I read heritage policy management papers, etc., and go through it from there. So we're talking about something that is a legacy to the past and could be a physical artifact. It's also something that needs to be controlled by an organisation. Our organisation is going to be English Historic Scotland. We fall under the UK Marine Policy Statement, and that highlights that any of these heritage assets, a nice good management term there, have significance, and therefore, depending on how significant they are, they might also justify statutory designation. Well, the A1 is significant enough to justify statutory designation, and that's why we were then employed to take the potting off it that was causing it damage. So it's historic wrecks are protected on account of the historical, archaeological, and artistic importance, and they can be considered wrecks themselves or parts thereof. To this, and it's these heritage assets are supposed to be protected for current, as in this, and future generations. So that's me and thee, plus our kids and any grandchildren, etc., that might still be twinkles in the eyes, etc. And they should be conserved, and this should be appropriate and proportional to their significance. So we've got two key aspects there, conserved and proportional to the significance. Well, we can see that arguably the A1 isn't being conserved because it's been allowed to be damaged, but is that proportional and appropriate to its significance? If it's not that significant, are we that worried about it? So they're questions that need to be answered. So we can look at HE's Historic England's Conservation Statement and Conservation Management Plans, which is a book if you want to go get it. 2013 gives you the background for that, or you can go to British Standards Guide to Conservation of Historic Buildings, and that is referred to in Historic England's Conservation Principles, Policies and Guidance, which we use. This has 6 high-level principles. That is, the historic environment is a shared resource. It's there for all of us. Everyone should be able to participate in sustaining the historic environment. So we've got 2 linking words there, everyone and a shared resource, but also we're going to say sustained, which links to conservation again, and also historic environment linking back to our heritage assets. So that's where these words start coming out. Understanding significance of places is vital. So we must understand its significance. And to be honest with you, when I started on this with Martin, I didn't really understand the full significance of the A1. Significant places should be managed to sustain their values. So if it is significant, the organisation, Historic England, should manage it to sustain its values. But what are those values? Decisions about change must be reasonable, transparent, and consistent. Well, those are interesting terms. Reasonable, that goes back against its significant. Transparent, so we must be able to define why we're doing things, and they must be consistent. So this should fall across all our protected wrecks, not just the A1. And they should be consistent throughout their time period, from day one, from its protection, all the way through until eventually it might disappear. Documenting and learning time decision is essential. Well, there's a good project management term, isn't it? We always have to learn from the project and any decisions that have been made going forward. So taking all of this, heritage management is understanding and sustaining the significance of that heritage artifact. So we're going to have to learn how to understand it and also then be able to sustain it. Next slide, please, Mark. So significant and historic values, we can go back to good practice advice and planning too to understand what we mean about this. And there are 4 different categories to describe how people value historic places as far as historic England are concerned. And it's a good framework to use so we are making consistent and transparent decisions on what we're doing. So we look at evidential value, the potential of a place to provide evidence about an historic activity. So we've got HMS Dreadnought there with a B class and C class submarines on the surface. If that was all still here, we would then have good evidential value of that actual time period. And that is when Parliament came down and had a look at the Navy to understand whether or not they're going to add more money to the Treasury so we could have a bigger Navy going in towards the war, First World War. Historic value. Historic people, events, and aspects of life could be connected to the present through the place. So that's in Portsmouth. It was an historic time period, etc., and it would have historic value if we have any of those vessels remaining. B class and C class submarines are around, and Dreadnought unfortunately isn't, but there are other types of dreadnoughts around that we could link towards this. Aesthetic value, well, that's your sensory and intellectual stimulation. You might not like a Wiley, I do, so I find them interesting, but also I quite like shiny bits of brass, even if they are archaeologically important and in museums or under the water. I quite like the way they look, so it'll create an aesthetic value for me and draw me towards diving towards a site or going to visit a museum. And there should be communal value, the meanings and associations of a place for the people who relate to it. Well, we can see Dreadnought in Portsmouth Harbour with Gosport, and that would create a communal value for those areas. In this drawing, though, we can't see an A class. Next one. So this painting would have virtually no significance as far as A1 went, also we think. So how significant is the A1? So I looked around and we looked at the Wessex Archaeological Report 2006, and that gave us some clue as to what the significance of the A1 was. So are these, though, meaningful statements? So the A1 was considered originally laid down as a Holland boat, and that's been talked about consistently throughout most of the research we've done, which is secondary, third sources about the A1. Is this evidential and historically significant? Originally laid down as a Holland boat? It's not really saying much to me. There's nothing meaningful saying that in that statement. The A1 can be considered unique. Again, is this significant? We have the Resurgam up in North Wales. That's a unique ship, but submarine, but could be classed as an outlier of no significance to the development of the Royal Navy submarine force, and therefore of very little historical significance. It's probably more significant to the development of the underground train systems between Liverpool and Birkenhead, because the engine that was used in it, and that is still there, is an early example of that. But for the submarine itself, it's significant as being unique. Doesn't necessarily mean anything in any way. The A1 marked down contrast to the Holland boats proved to be a very dangerous vessel. Well, again, is that a meaningful statement? It was a very dangerous vessel. Was that good or bad? I don't know. It doesn't really say anything. So to me, none of this really means much. In 1904, the A1 was involved in manoeuvres. Well, if you've ever been in the Navy or played around with them, then you know that there's plenty of manoeuvres ongoing all the time. So that's not really very meaningful. The crew lost their lives, which is a shame, and are buried in Holy Trinity Church near Royal Navy Submarine Museum, Gosport. Alarm bells there is a statement that's factually probably incorrect, because they're not buried in Holy Trinity Church, they're buried outside, away from there. So immediately we started looking at this and going, well, I'm not too sure what's been written is actually correct. And also it's not really not giving any meaningful thing, but it does mean its local communal value is there. So it's making a link direct to that community. The wreck was relocated and salvaged. As a result of the accident, it was decided to fit a second watertight hatch to the base of the conning tower. Nice bit of detail, but What does that actually mean? Is that significant, or is that just something that's a feature that's already been on the Hollands or not? Doesn't really say anything. A1 was put back into service, but ended her days as a submerged target. Well done. We don't necessarily mean anything there either. Unmanned submerged target or anti-submarine warfare training. Well, there's plenty of those around and we don't protect those. So why is this one protected? So again, is there any meaningful statement there? So it was decided, next slide, to look at this and reassess the significance and make it meaningful. So if we look back at that initial statement about the A1 being a dangerous vessel, about coming around and having its batteries causing issues, etc., the A1 is marked contrast to the Holland boats proved to be a very dangerous vessel. When it was coming around Land's End, the crew had to abandon the boat. So what does that mean? So next slide, or next one on, Martin. So if we go and look at the original document, confidential report, next one, we will see what Bacon, who's in charge of the submarines at this time, said. And he was also the designer of the A1. It's a very interesting report that shows the A-type submarine can stand and be comfortable in a heavy sea, as Captain Bacon says, and accounted for by the extra height and size of the conning tower. Now, this is a significant point because the A1 was the first submarine, British naval submarine, to be designed with a high conning tower, which is a type of conning tower you would see on virtually every other hunter-killer class submarine that we have now. The Hollands before didn't have that. This is important in understanding, as it says, a great advantage in respect of being at sea. Next bit, one. And it goes on saying, yes, they'd be more visible, so therefore they have to be underwater to attack. And that's where the periscope comes in and why they needed to have that as well. But as for this accident, well, actually, the accident of the batteries has given us useful information, which will enable the weak point to be remedied. This should be done at once in all other boats. So as opposed to being a unique vessel, features of the A1 were then pushed into every other boat. That included reaching back into the Hollands, but also reaching forward into the other A classes and B classes and C classes that went from there. So this actually allows us to make a more meaningful statement about these incidences and how the A1 was at the forefront of technology and development of the submarine class at the time. Next slide. So as we go along, hit it again. Evidential value is actually very high. Next slide, Martin. So the first conning tower on a naval submarine. And if you want, you can go see the original drawings that Bacon did in pencil, so they weren't even inked in at this time, and we know it's specific to the A1, because in the top right of his initial design concept, you can see submarine A1 conning tower fittings, and that was his original drawing from 1903, and based on pictures, but also based on the submarine underwater as well. So first conning tower developed onto the A1, and it's still there. So evidential value is very high. Next slide. We've also got all the artifacts that were primarily pulled up in 1997 from the binoculars, but also in the bottom left part of that first periscope. So the Hollands had a viewing tube. They didn't have a periscope. And that's one of the earliest parts of the earliest periscopes ever developed, which have then moved on through a number of iterations to the current periscopes we still have in submarines today. So she's the first one to have a proper periscope developed and fitted to it. Next one, aesthetic values. Historic value. So we can go straight from the A1 with the conning tower into the astute classes with a couple of changes here, there, including nuclear power as opposed to petrol power. Aesthetic value. Next slide. We can look back at this and say there's a Wiley and there's no link to A1, but if you actually read the description underneath at this presentation to Parliament, it's the A classes that are used to come up alongside the dreadnought and then submerged, showing the capability of the submarine, which is why they're not depicted here, as the B classes and C classes went along on the surface. So this nimble A1 went underneath the C, behind the dreadnought, and then came up in front of it, to the wow of the crowds watching. Next one. And then communal value. Wiley again at the top. You can see Gosport there with the submarine port where all the submarines go, and we've got A classes down in the front right going back home. And we can see Gosport now where the Hasler Creek is where those submarines were first based. And we know that from Bacon's reports. The A1 was based here, and the A1 is an actual Portsmouth boat. And Spithead area was very important in understanding submarine warfare tactics and strategy. Next slide. So, statement on significance, we can go back to Bacon himself in 1903, and that is the Holland boats were too small. If submarines were to become vessels of practical value, their size and speed would have to be increased. I started the design and manufacture of a larger vessel, which he names as the A1. By the end of 1904, Bacon goes on, saying sufficient progress had been made to provide a sure foundation of submarine boats and their practical work at sea. The A1 was the boat that was providing that, because it was a larger one and providing the evidence that you could have larger submarines. The rest of the world was developing large submarines, but they were finding it very difficult to actually utilize them. The initial trials, not down in Spithead, but actually up in Cumbria, off Barrow, showed that the A1 was a very, very good practical working and sea boat. So she wasn't a dangerous vessel, wasn't considered dangerous at the time. Yes, she might have been a bit accidental, but she was a highly experimental vessel at the forefront of technology, cutting edge stuff. You know, Elon Musk has just launched his space rockets, and like he says, you're going to have a couple of ones go missing, because that's how you develop technology to get on. And it was the same for the A1. Next slide. So as we go and look at her significance, we can say Protected Wreck A1 represents the foundation of a new branch of warfare in the Royal Navy Submarine Service. As simple as that, and that comes from Bacon. So you go from your Viking longships to the Mary Rose to the Warrior, and then you'll branch out into this new form of warfare, submarine warfare, maybe continue with service ships, which are now called targets, and are targets to every other submarine. And also don't forget, at this point, but slightly after the submarines, we've got the development of the aircraft carriers as a new form of warfare as well. Next slide.
So the question is, what do these things have in common? And bizarrely, it's called the A1. So one of the places that many of the places that we visited in order to have a look at the management plan and get the basis of the forward was all these various places. So National Archives, if you want to actually get to the truth of the matter, then there's no doubt about it. You've actually got to go and see the source material. And I think one of the key things that I've learned from this in particular is you just do not believe anything on the internet. You've really got to go and see it for yourself. And sometimes you've actually got to go and see the tangible artifacts as well. So it's been really important for myself in particular, to go along and see some of this stuff firsthand. And all these places that we've visited have been just phenomenal and amazing, really, in terms of getting information. I'm going back to this original history timeline now. So if we just talk about its early years, so laid down in February 1902, it was the first British design built and submarine. The interesting fact that came out of some of the research we did was the new all British submarines were initially to be named after prehistoric reptiles, and the if I can say it, Ichthyosaurus was to be initially called the A1. So that's quite an interesting fact that came out of the research. And it's really important to recognise that this, the A1 was at the cutting edge of technology, and Bacon used this to learn and improve from the boats, even when they'd been in accidents, effectively. So we discovered that the A1 had in fact sank 3 times, not 2, as you'll see if you read on the internet. The only thing you'll see is it sank twice. Well, actually, in reality, it sank 3 times, and it had 2 explosions. So you can see these sort of along the timeline as we go along up until its final ending in August 1911. But the whole point of the submarine, when it sort of, after its final sort of ending in August, when it had its accident in August 1910, was it moving over to become an experimental submarine, and all these other tests were then performed on it. Sadly, all the crew died in its first tragic loss in collision with the Berwick Castle. So this event is well recorded on the 18th of March 1904. And it was a huge shock to the Royal Navy Service. They never envisaged that this kind of event could happen. 2 officers, 9 men were drowned. The youngest casualty was Sub-Lieutenant Churchill, who was only 21, son of Vice Admiral Orford Churchill, who was directly related to Winston Churchill. So that family's got quite a good history there of warfare and being part of the services. So during the time, we were researching the British newspaper archives and the tragedy of the Titanic submersible, which is very much in the news in the last few months ago. Was also filling the media with news and speculation of every aspect of the search for the missing craft. And it was very much the case in 1904 when the accident happened. So with at least, as far as we can ascertain, at least 500 newspaper reports were done across the UK and overseas. So the synergy is very, very similar. All right. And moving across, coverage of the military funeral was also solemn and reflected the mood of the nation. So the funeral procession with over 700 Royal Navy and Army personnel representing every ship in the Navy and every Army regiment in Hampshire stretched the full length of what's known Dead Men's Mile, which is a road that leads to Haslar Cemetery, where the crew are finally buried. So crowds of onlookers lined the roadside following the interment. 100 rifles fired 3 shots, and the last post was sounded. So a really big event of its time. So connecting with the past. So again, the research really through our visits to the Shipwreck Centre and Maritime Museum, where there's almost 100 artifacts recovered from the A1. So it's really worth a visit if you do go over to the Isle of Wight. So it really allowed us to understand better the life of the early submariners. And this T-urn that you can see, and it's actually pictured in the black and white photograph we found here along with the hatch. So, you know, it's a real connection of the actual T-urn that crew member was holding. So that's really amazing, really, to find that. And one of the other really interesting things that we came across, and everyone talks about pigeon post, and perhaps we mock the Royal the Royal Mail a bit too much, but in the National Museum of the Royal Navy Archives, we came across a pigeonogram. Okay, and this is PS form number 8, and it was sent by H. Smith from the salvage vessel Bellos to the pigeon loft over in Gosport. And the actual it actually reads: "Received birds from destroyer," and forms all correct. One bird has lost its eye, pecked out. And then the message, really, the important bit is number 12,000 Blue Diver went down at 2:30 a.m. this morning. I believe they are going to float her again this afternoon. Captain Bacon is out here. So, you know, this whole connection of how information was transmitted many years ago is fascinating. The other connection we've got is, so going back to August 1910, when the submarine was declared obsolete, but then moved into this experimental unit. In December 1910, A1, whilst unmanned under tow, successfully picked up a mine using a new sweeper equipment, so that was a success story for her. In May 1911, A1 was towed to Bullet Patch to the west of Selsey and submerged using weights to a depth of 8 to 10 feet. Torpedo boats then fired light lyddite shells at the submarine to assess the effectiveness of the type of explosive charge. And what we're seeing there, A1 sank, indicating some damage to the hull integrity. A1 was raised and returned to Portsmouth for examination. So what we have there really is the concept of depth charges. On her final sinking, on the third sinking, so there was an experiment to test lifting apparatus for recovery of sunken submarines, fitted with automatic systems to control the submarine. On this occasion, no crew were on board. She was fitted with these wire hawsers around the hull, which you'll still see today if you dive with me on the wreck. And sadly, the submarine disappeared and they never had a chance to find it again. But if we look at the significance, going back to the significance of A1, then we've got all these firsts that we can look at quickly. We've got the design, first British designed and built for offensive as well as defensive capability, fitted with a large conning tower. It was the first loss of life in the submarine service. It had the first proper periscope fitted within the conning tower, which is again really important. As far as we can ascertain, it was the first welded submarine and possibly the first in the Royal Navy. And it also had many new devices trialled for the first time. And it was instrumental in all these other things as well. So I think we can really say that A1 itself is a significant submarine. And thank you for your time and engagement, and I hope you found this interesting.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Doug. If you want to turn your cameras on, we should be able to see you for the questions. Oh, look at that, Martin. You're underwater.
Interesting.
Do we have Doug as well? If anyone has any questions for Martin and Doug, then do put them in the chat or in the Q&A session. Can I ask a question about the, well, firstly say I mean, there seems to be an awful lot of new stuff, Martin, that you've you and Doug have been able, and Alison presumably have been able to uncover over the course of the creation of the Conservation Statement and Management Plan, because there's lots of new things that I've never heard you say before.
Yeah. We have been very busy digging deep into archives, and all of us really, Alison, Doug, myself, we really have been digging deep. And I think that's the beauty of perhaps ourselves doing it rather than perhaps passing it out to a company that has only got so much time to spend on it. We have spent a lot of time, but in fairness, we've come up with a lot of information and detail, which has been real value, I think, more than anything else.
I completely agree. I'm sure it's a wonderful example of value added, that somebody and a team that are actually excited and passionate about the topic that they're researching, rather than necessarily doing it as a contracted job. Absolutely. And it's not surprising there's lots of firsts, because I mean, it's only right for a submarine called A1 that there's a lot of firsts in it. It's like a perfect name. Can I ask about the outcomes of the Conservation Statement and Management Plan in terms of, I mean, I know this, I'm doing one myself for a different site, but the purpose, what HE will use it for and what you will be able to use it for?
Doug, do you want to pick up on that?
So what HE will use it for will hopefully be to inform their own management decisions for the site, and that will fall out of the policy. So the conservation statement is made around the significance, etc. The management plan will then take forward the policies, and that involves stakeholder engagement, which will be the NAS, it will be Submarine Museums, obviously be the owners, Martin Woodward, and HE themselves, as well as push it out to other stakeholders. So we'll then see what the policy is that people want to do with the site, but it's very difficult to know what to do with the site if you don't know how significant it actually is. And on the value added bit, there's lots of stuff on the Hollands as well that will add value to those wreck sites. And I see somebody's asked a question about the A3, A5, A7. Yes, there is, because there are statements about what the difference between the A1 and the A3 and then the latest ships are, and goes backwards. So we've got all of that.
Yes, while you're there looking at, obviously targeting in on one, actually you're there also capturing lots and lots of information and evidence about the other associated ones that it will have had an impact on. Can I ask, just seeing if there's any other questions or comments? We've got about a minute probably. Can I ask about the timeline between that discovery and the reporting? There was this pause, wasn't there? There was this gap, and it was almost as if as Martin alluded to, who knows what happened then? Is this like a dark period where we don't actually know? You don't yet know what was going on.
Out of this, coincidentally, one of the early divers is just down the road from where I live, and I recognised the name Triton. And when we were across talking to Martin Woodward, he said it was the Triton divers. Well, I thought that was Triton in Southsea. It's not. It's the Triton divers at Chichester. So I've been chatting to them, and they suggest they originally found it in the 87. They recovered the binnacle then, and then didn't do any other recoveries, partly because they couldn't get into it, I think. But they're open to full discussion. They've been very helpful. They've got all the early videos, all the other photographs, all their early dive logs, etc. And they're really up to writing up their history about the A1.
Well, that's great. Great new connection that's been made. Okay, well, we've run out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you very much to Doug and to Martin for our first case study of the afternoon.